Our next speaker is from Financial Times. He's a senior editor. He has covered Africa and commodities for 15 years. He had written about the oil price when it was down at 10 US dollars. That's a very low price. And when he was writing, he took it to $150. So stop writing on that one. He's been in different zones of the world, and as you know, where there's oil, there's often big troubles. It means war zones, the latest one being Libya, and you've also been in the Middle East. As Javier says, fortunately now, the issue of today is shale oil. That's in North Dakota. It might be a wild place in the US, but it's safe. And we can also say Tivoli Congress Center in Copenhagen today seems a pretty safe place. So we are ready for another speech, another good speech even. And Javier Blas, please welcome.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitations to address this conference. And I'm particularly delighted following some of the fantastic speakers this morning. And now I have a big problem because I am between you and the coffee break in about 30 minutes, and was between you and Jim Rogers, who is a much better speaker, talking about where to put your money in 2014. I'm going to tell you a bit about the topic of today, shale oil and the threat to the oil price. Let me see if I get this right. Yeah, perfect. Let me start telling you that shale oil is huge, it's a fantastic revolution, and particularly for the United States, it's going to change its competitive position in the global economy. But if you think that shale oil is going to change the world of oil prices and is going to trigger a massive crisis and we're going to go back to where we were 15 years ago, about $10 a barrel, you are completely wrong. Shale oil is very important for the United States, it's important for the oil industry, but it will not trigger a collapse in oil prices, it will not trigger the end of OPEC, and in Saudi Arabia they are just doing fine. But you could be perplexed by what I'm saying, because if you read the newspaper, you read a lot about shale. Indeed, we have a shale bubble in the newspaper industry. That is the number of news stories that we at the Financial Times, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal have been writing over the last 15 years, give or take, about shale. And as you see, it has been a huge explosion of news. That gives you a sense of how important the shale industry has become for us. Last year, the FT and my two competitors, we wrote 4,013 news stories about shale. Just for the record, we wrote only 800 about OPEC. And OPEC probably is the most and biggest factor in the oil market. And this year, the inflation, the shale news inflation continues. In the first 9 days of the year, we have wrote already 100 news stories between the three newspapers and our websites about shale. So if we continue at the current pace, you annualize that, we're going to go by the end of the year between 4,500 and 5,000 news stories. So it's going to continue going up. What all that inflation in news, so that interest in shale, has done to the oil price? If you look at Brent on the other big chart, you will see that no much really. The price of Brent in 2013 on average was $108 with $71. That's more or less the same price in 2012 and 2011. So the shale revolution so far is not having a major impact in oil prices. Indeed, the last 3 years, if you look at annual average, I think is the best indicator. The last 3 years have been the best 3 years ever in terms of absolute oil price, both in nominal and real terms. So far, the shale revolution is not triggering a massive impact in the oil industry and the oil price, and I'm going to go to tell you why. But also, let me remove also what I call is a myth, that the shale oil revolution in the United States is going to trigger a massive change in the geopolitics of the world, because the United States, Washington, is going to say goodbye to the Middle East. It's not going to have to worry any longer about Saudi Arabia. Is the say of that some people in Washington believe strongly, and I don't. A crisis erupts in Baghdad, Tehran, or Riyadh at 5 o'clock in the morning, Washington time, and you do not need to wake up the president because shale oil has saved us. Well, shale oil has triggered some consequences for the United States. The US is importing a lot less oil of what we call in the industry light and sweet characteristics. That's oil that is very easy to refine. It's high quality oil that is very easy to refine into gasoline. But let me just, sorry, I'm gonna put the clock so I know when I have to stop talking. Very good, it's working. So what has been the impact? Shale oil produced a lot of high quality oil. Where was the United States importing high quality oil? Nigeria. The US has almost stopped buying crude oil from Nigeria. But, excuse me, what about Saudi Arabia? How much oil the United States is importing from Saudi Arabia? Well, the US imported from Saudi Arabia 1.4 million barrels a day on average last year. How much he did in 2000? Exactly 1.4. How much he did before the financial crisis in 2008? 1.5. As you see, the shale revolution has triggered no change whatsoever in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Neither, if you look at another example, the United Arab Emirates or Kuwait for that matter. Why is that? Well, and why shale oil is not having that major impact into the global oil market, the global oil price. Excuse me. That's the increase in oil production from the United States from January 2009 to December of 2013. And as you see in the graphic, it's a big increase. It's increasing by 3.5 million barrels a day, and that's a significant change for the oil market. And you will suppose that 3.5 million barrels extra will have a major impact in oil prices. But the main problem of that inflation of news of shale is that sometimes we are only focusing on shale and forgetting everything else. It will be like looking at the Danish stock market or in Scandinavia, the stock market, and thinking, I'm gonna look at Nokia. Well, probably you are only looking at Nokia, you will have a problem. It will be like going into my home country, Spain, and looking at the construction companies. Well, if you only look at the construction companies, you are going to think it's a disaster. You cannot look at isolation of the oil market. You need to look at the whole context. So while shale oil was adding a lot of barrels, there were some troubles happening. OPEC disruptions in the same period reduced 2.4 million barrels a day of production. That's Libya, that's Iran, that's also a bit of Nigeria, and that's a bit of Venezuela here and there. At the same time, we lost also 1.1 million barrels a day from the North Sea, mostly from the UK sector, a bit also from the Norwegian sector, because the North Sea is getting mature. The oil fields are producing less and less every year. The result is that the two combined was 3.5 million barrels a day of losses, that it used exactly what the shale oil was adding to the global oil market. So at the end of the day, if you look at the global picture, you take the wide angle lens, you will see that shale oil was more than compensated by disruptions in OPEC and by the decline in production in the North Sea. Also, it's very important to look at the context of global oil demand. Shale oil is happening at a moment that global oil demand remains quite robust. The comparison between shale oil and the revolution that the discovery of the North Sea and the discovery of Alaska triggered to the oil market in the 80s is grown. And it's grown not because it's not grown in terms of supply. Shale oil is bringing a lot of new supplies into the market, and probably is bringing even more supplies than the North Sea and Alaska put together. However, in the 80s, the main problem for the oil market and the reason why prices collapsed is that the demand was very, very slow. The demand growth was negative. We were contracting, reducing our demand for oil every year. For the last 14 years, as you see, we have had constant increases in oil demand, barring the drop in 2008, 2009, due to the global financial crisis. And even when we are talking today by some people saying, oh, but global oil demand is slowing down, look at the global economy, look at China, look at the emerging markets. Actually, it's not true. As you see, 2013 was a very good year in terms of oil demand, was right on average or slightly average for the last 10 years in terms of incremental oil demand. And all what we are forecasting for 2014 is also very similar. We are continuing at pace, we are continuing very strongly with oil demand. So, shale oil is being absorbed by the global economy. You look at China, the picture is very similar. China is gonna add about 400,000 barrels a day of extra consumption in 2014. That's more or less what he added to his consumption in 2013. And if you remove 2010 and 2004 that they were completely outside years, it is, again, more or less what it has been doing over the last 10 years. So there is not a significant change there. I recently met Ali Naimi, who is the Minister of Saudi Arabia, and he has a peculiar way of enjoying the company of journalists. Every time that there's an OPEC meeting in Vienna, he takes us after first pray, that's about 5:30 in the morning for the record, for jogging. I mean, you could look me, I'm not a kind of guy who wakes up for jogging. I don't wake up at 5:30 in the morning for jogging for sure. Indeed, my girlfriend says that the only person who could get me out of bed at 5:30 in the morning for an hour of jogging is Minister Naimi. Anyway, it was my last jogging because I was moving for having to cover every OPEC meeting. And Minister Naimi was so kind to invite me after the pain of the jogging for breakfast. So I ordered some bacon and eggs and, you know, all the stuff. He was looking to me like, of course, he ordered some fruit and granola thing. I feel really bad. Anyway, so I said, sir, what keeps you awake? I mean, what worries you? And obviously, Minister Naimi doesn't get worried. He gets concerned. So he said, oh, nothing worries me, but I have some concerns. So, okay, well, sir, what are your concerns? And he didn't say shale. What he's worried about or concerned about is if the global economy goes south, if China goes south, then shale oil becomes a problem for the oil market because you don't have enough demand every year to absorb all the extra barrels. But he told me that as long as the global economy continues growing as it's doing today, as long as we add about 1 million barrels a day every year of extra demand, the global oil market could absorb the shale revolution just fine. And I think that that's a very interesting point, and probably he's right. And if you look at what has been happening on the oil market over the last 3 years, and forget that you have read 4,000 news stories about shale and only 800 about OPEC, probably he is absolutely right. And here is one demonstration of why Minister Naimi is completely right. Look at Saudi Arabia production. You look at 2013, that's on average, that was 9.7 million barrels a day on average through the year. At some point during the summer, they were pumping 10.5 million barrels a day of oil out of Saudi Arabia. That's the highest since '81. That's the highest since the second oil crisis. And that's in spite of a massive revolution that in theory should be just meaning the end of Saudi Arabia as a business organization. It is not. Indeed, they are producing the most in, give it or take, 30 years. What about other countries in the Middle East? Kuwait is producing about 2.8 million barrels a day during the summer of 2013. That's the most that Kuwait has produced since 1973, during the first oil crisis. So they are just fine. And what about the United Arab Emirates? They were producing The statistics are a bit murky. You look at the official numbers from the International Energy Agency, it's about 2.8 million barrels a day. If you look at what Abu Dhabi officially said, it's about 3 million barrels a day. Regardless of what those two numbers you believe, that's the highest ever. The United Arab Emirates have not produced more oil in his history. And that's a sign of how that trio of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait, that they are critical for OPEC and for Middle East policy, are just doing and riding the storm of shale just as fine as I said. Non-OPEC supply, of course, because of the shale revolution, is increasing, but it's also playing catch up. We have a lot of negative years and a lot of years where incremental non-OPEC supply was very low and for sure was not enough to meet the increase in global oil demand, requiring more and more OPEC supplies. We probably are going to have 2 or 3 years of very strong non-OPEC supply, but also very important, while the shale revolution is happening in the United States, and you may be tempted to extrapolate 2012, 2013, 2014 into the next decade and thinking, well, the production is going to be coming. In 3 to 4 years, the United States shale revolution will start to plateau and the incremental production will not be coming. And then can be the shale oil revolution exported elsewhere? If you look at geology, for sure. Indeed, probably there is more shale oil reservoirs in Argentina and Siberia, some areas in Europe, that they are in the United States. But the geology is not what really, of course, for sure, China. But geology is not the only problem to develop the shale oil revolution. Legislation and law is very important. One of the critical reasons why the shale revolution is happening in the United States is that the ownership of the mineral rights is for whoever owns the land. In many European countries, many Latin American countries, you could own the land, but 30 centimeters underground is the property of the state. And the incentive for the shale revolution is not exactly the same. It's not the same if someone is just telling you, a company is taking your land or paying for some of the land and giving you maybe a check of, say, 5,000 euros, that someone telling you that they are going to extract something from your land that is underground, and they will be paying you a couple of million euros a year or as royalty. The incentive for the owners is very different. Also, the United States have a very mature and robust oil industry. Lots of petroleum engineers, lots of oil service companies willing to do any job. They have a very flexible and deep capital markets, venture capitalists who are willing to finance those guys in North Dakota that 5 years ago came with this crazy idea of injecting water, sand, and chemicals to break the rocks and extract the oil that was trapped there. You don't have that in China for sure. You have some capital markets in Argentina, but anyone in the room is willing to put, say, $10 million in Argentina these days? God, Buenos Aires is a lovely place to be. You should consider going to Buenos Aires and put some money. I have to speak up for Buenos Aires. I'm Spanish after all. Capital markets are going to be another big problem. And the final problem is logistics, pipelines. We see the problems that the boom is creating in the United States, where crude oil has to be transported by trucks and trains. And that's even considering that they have a very robust and very capillary network of pipelines. Without that network of pipelines, the shale revolution cannot happen elsewhere. And the pipelines are not there in Europe, they are not there in Argentina, they are not there in Russia, neither in China. So it's going to be difficult to extrapolate the shale revolution elsewhere. And another problem is that while the shale revolution is happening and adding supplies, a group of countries that I call the BRICS are not increasing production of oil as we were expecting. Those BRICS are not the traditional BRICS that you are used to listen about from Jim O'Neill, formerly at Goldman Sachs, but those are a new category of BRICS that I call as Brazil, Russia, Iraq, and Kazakhstan. the BRICS oil countries were supposed to add a lot of production to the oil market since 2010 and all the way to 2025. And so far, they are not doing so. Indeed, in some cases, are producing even less than in the past. You look at Brazil, with the discovery of the pre-salt oil offshore, it was supposed to be also a big revolution. And indeed, Brazilian production not only increased as we were expecting, but in 2013 hit the lowest level in 5 years. Russian production, if you look at the former Soviet Union as a whole, has been stagnant for the last few years, particularly when you look at exports. That is what really matters for the oil market. If you look at Iraq, we were expecting Iraq to increase its production last year by about 500,000 barrels a day with all those investments that they were putting in the international oil companies. Indeed, Iraqi oil production last year fell year on year, and some international oil companies who were supposed to make the big investments and the billions of dollars are negotiating with the government in Baghdad to get out. And when you see ExxonMobil rushing for the door in Iraq, you could think that things are not particularly good for an investor. ExxonMobil doesn't get out of a country unless he sees really that it's not going to make any money. So that's a pretty good sign that the Iraqi oil production is going to struggle to increase. If you look at the recent violence in the country, where probably is the worst in 3 to 4 years, it's also a pretty good indicator that things are not getting right. Kazakhstan, very similar. Last year, 2013, was the year where Kazakhstan was going to put in production the Kashagan oil field, one of the biggest discoveries in the oil industry over the last 20 years. It has been delayed again. They're talking now about June 2014. Some people have been telling me that it's looking more like the first half of 2015 instead. And that means that about 250,000 of incremental oil is not coming to the market as we were expecting. Where shale oil is having a big impact? Shale oil is having a big impact in the oil industry, in equities, in the companies. And why is that? Well, for 2 reasons. It's true that shale oil is putting a bit of pressure on oil prices, particularly putting pressure on oil prices in the United States, local oil prices in the United States. Probably you have seen the stories that US oil prices are much lower than the international prices because the market is flooded and you cannot export the crude oil. So there is a pressure on prices, and at the same time, the shale revolution is lifting costs. If you look at upstream capital cost index, you see that has been increasing steadily since 2000 and remains very high. And why is that? Well, look at the number of producing wells that they are in the Bakken in North Dakota. That Bakken is mostly the North Dakota area. It has been also an explosion. It's more than almost 6,000 wells. There's a lot of wells to be drilled. There's a lot of kit that is tied up with those wells, and also shale formations require permanent equipment. You need compressors, you need pumping capacity, and that's just, I'm talking about huge trackside pumping facilities to put the water, the sun, and the chemicals down underground. That means that the shale revolution is using a lot of capital, is using a lot of equipment, and is keeping all the costs associated with the industry very high. And at the same time, is putting a lead on prices. Prices are not rocketing. They are stable around $110, and putting a pressure down in local oil prices. The result is margins are getting compressed. And that is, while I do not think that the shale oil revolution is going to have a big impact in the flat oil price, what we call the Brent price, I do think that the shale revolution could have a major impact in equities because costs are going to remain very high and are going to be a squeeze in the profitability of the sector. See how much time I have left before I continue telling you. Ooh, okay, I'm good. A couple of questions on costs. The shale revolution will continue unless prices drop around $80. Below $80, I think that a lot of investors in shale will think twice about putting their money. I'm not saying that that's the marginal cost of production. I think that the marginal cost of production of shale is a bit lower than that. But if you are an investor and you are putting oil in, you are putting your money on shale, you are aiming at least for a 15% internal rate of return. And to get that 15%, you need around $80 a barrel for West Texas Intermediate. That's the benchmark in the US. That probably equals to about $90-95 for Brent. If we were to see Brent prices, what we look in Europe, dropping significantly below $90, we will have a significant slowdown in the shale revolution. And also, and that's important, and that's just coming back to my conversation with Minister Naimi, something he gets very angry is what he called the lack of sense of history on the journalists. He asked me very pointedly, do you study history in college? Because you guys seem to have forgotten everything. Forgot even what happened 10 years ago. Even if we were down to $90, that will be the 5th highest annual average ever. $90 will be a pretty good price. I'm pretty sure if I have asked one of your neighbors, I was yesterday in Oslo, if I have asked 10 years ago the Minister of Finance of Norway if he will just sign for $90 a barrel, he will have signed a white paper, no questions asked, $90, that's a fine price. Even if we go to $90, that's a very good price, that's a very good price for Saudi Arabia, and it's not the end of OPEC by any means. Talking about the oil market and a bit beyond the shale revolution, what geopolitical factors to watch this year in 2014? Well, an interesting collection of countries because you have all kind of almost the bad countries, Iran, Venezuela, and then you have the United States. I'm not suggesting that the US is in that category, but I think that you have to pay a lot of attention this year for the US. But let's start with Iran. Production in Iran has been disrupted because of the sanctions by Europe and the United States. They are coming back to the nuclear, to the negotiation table about the nuclear program. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on Iran. I speak with a lot of experts on Iran. If I ask 5 experts on Iran what is going to happen on the nuclear negotiations, I get about 25 different answers, so they don't know either. But it's true that they are negotiating. Iranian production about 3 years ago was running close to 4 million barrels a day. Today it's about 2.5 because the list of major customers of Iran has been reduced for about 2025 to about 4. Only Japan, China, India, and a bit of Turkey are buying Iranian oil because the rest, they are not able to do it because of the sanctions. If the negotiations were to be positive and a resolution was achieved, a lot of oil could come back to the market. I don't think that is a risk for 2014. I think that we are going to go through the whole year in negotiations. There are going to be a lot of setbacks. It could be potentially a risk for 2015. But one thing is very clear, not incremental oil is going to come on the market or get out of the market, but every time that there is a statement in Geneva during the negotiations or is any statement in Tehran, probably in Farsi for domestic consumption of the Iranians, the market is going to react and it will be probably an overreaction. I think that for 2014, Venezuela is a much bigger risk. It's a country that produces about 2.5 million barrels a day. Maduro is the new president, replacing the late Hugo Chavez. He doesn't have the popularity of Chavez, and he's struggling. Inflation is absolutely sky high. Official numbers is about 25. Extra-official numbers and personal experience buying something in a supermarket in Caracas, I will say that inflation probably is running about 500% a year. Middle class is suffering a lot. It's a lot of violence. The country recently was shocked because Miss Venezuela was kidnapped and killed. It's a lot of pressure on Maduro, and it could be, again, a coup or a revolution or a strike. Last time it happened in 2002, at the end of 2002, the beginning of 2003, all the workers of the state-owned oil company PDVSA went on a strike, and production fell from 2.5 to 0, and stayed there for 6 weeks. So Venezuela, I think, is a country that you need to pay a lot of attention if you are looking at the oil market. Nigeria has a similar problem in a way. It's heading into elections in 2015. For years, the ruling party has been commanding power. and elections were just a mere exercise where you knew who was going to win at the end of the day. For the first time, the opposition, they were split in 3 groups. They have come together over the last 12 months, and now in the polls are coming ahead of the government, of the ruling party. That could trigger a lot of interest by the ruling party to win the elections for means that they are not democratic, and we can have also disruptions in the oil industry. Libya, as you know, we went into support of the revolution in 2011. Since then, it has not been particularly pretty. Oil production that should be running about 1.5 million barrels a day. That was the level with Gaddafi. Never recovered to that level, but we went all the way to 1.3. Since then, production has collapsed. They're doing more or less nothing. The eastern half part of the country where the revolution started in Benghazi wants independence, and the main problem is most of the oil in Libya is on the east, and obviously Tripoli doesn't want that area of the country to leave. It's a lot of violence. It's not looking good. I have been speaking with people on the ground on the oil fields. They say that the situation is very scary, and we can see at any point another round of very, very strong violence and the country descending into civil war. So not a particularly nice intervention. Another country where the West was deeply involved, South Sudan. We helped South Sudan to get his independence from Sudan. 2 years later, the leaders of South Sudan have decided to go into what looks increasingly a civil war. Oil production that is about 250,000 barrels a day has been already affected. It's not shut down completely because the Chinese are running most of the oil industry there, and they have a lot of higher appetite for operating in difficult circumstances. Some people will say they don't care so much about their workers as a company in Europe or the United States will care. And finally, the US, for 2 reasons. One, because linking Iran and the United States, President Obama is negotiating with the Iranians, and he's making good progress, but he needs Congress to be on board on those negotiations. And so far, Congress is way behind where President Obama is. And after all, the sanctions imposed on Iran are acts of law. They are acts of Congress that only Congress can reverse. President Obama cannot sign an executive order and change the sanctions on Iran. This is not similar to the Libyan-Iran Act of the 80s, where there was through executive orders. This is an act of Congress. It needs Congress, both houses, on board to repeal some of the legislation. And Congress, at the moment, even the Democrats, are not saying that. So President Obama may get an agreement with the Iranians, but he may get an agreement with his own Congress in Washington to change some of the sanctions. The other thing to pay attention in the United States is the debate about whether the US should be exporting oil or not. De facto, through a number of pieces of legislation, the US can, in reality, export oil other than to Canada. There's a debate in the US that has split the oil industry, whether that should be changed, and the US, because of the shale revolution, should be exporting oil. If that was to happen, that will have a very big impact in the relationship between the price of different qualities of crude oil, the kind of thing that interests a lot of the oil traders at Morgan Stanley or Glencore or Vitol or the trading houses, but it will not have a major impact on the price of what we look at, the price of oil, or more importantly, the price that we pay at the pump station when we are driving. And as I was telling you about Libya, I just wanted to give you a bit of an anecdote of how Libya looks like. And when I tell you that you need to pay attention about the geopolitics, why I say so. One of the funny things of being the commodities editor at the Financial Times or the Africa editors, you get to travel to all these crazy places and meet the people. So one day you're talking to an oil executive and tells you it's a bit scary, the people that we have protecting the oil field or controlling the oil installations. You don't get a sense that what he really means is that he has that group of people protecting the oil installations. My dad really likes, particularly the guy on the back with the hat and the RPG. The best thing was that after I took that picture, they gave me the RPG. It's a bit of a bazooka. So they put it on my shoulder, so I got it. I was just walking around, pointing towards a tank of oil. And then the guy tells me something in Arabic. I speak a bit of Arabic, but I don't understand what he says. So I ask my translator what this guy is saying. I say, oh, don't worry. He's just saying, be careful. Apparently, there is not a safety mechanism, and your finger is on the trigger. And my translator thought that was a minor detail that he could not need to translate. So anyway, that's the kind of situation that oil companies are dealing in Libya, in Nigeria. In Nigeria, it looks even worse, in South Sudan, and so on. And that's one of the reasons why the shale revolution is not having the impact that you will be expecting. And it's because many troubles in the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, are impacting in the oil market, reducing production, and mitigating the good news from shale. And with that, thank you so much for your attention.
Great.
Thank you.
We have one question. As you've learned today, we have this Norwegian origin. We were up there yesterday also. For those of us who've been around a little bit, we have listened to Norwegian finance ministers for 15 years or something. And they always come with the same story. And in runs like this, I'll try to show it. This is Norwegian oil revenue going into the state. So it goes up, and this is this point of time where we stand. And the projection says, be careful, it goes down.
Ah.
Then the Norwegian minister comes back 5 years, might be the same guy, might be a new one. He says, this is Norwegian oil revenue, but it might go down, and so on. And you mentioned the minister before. Looking at the figures for shale exploration, you could imagine it could be something of the same. So it goes up and up and up, but it's not that big a change. Things might happen, and it's a bit difficult and so on. And then you will come back in 3-5 years' time here and say, I was a bit cautious, but it went up and up and up and up. So what do you think?
Look, 5 years ago, the International Energy Agency, that is the agency who advises industrialized countries, was telling us that the main worry was peak oil, that oil production was going to peak very soon, and that we will keep our consumption growth at the current rate, we will have a big problem. And peak oil was one of the reasons why we went $150 a barrel. The same people who are behind those forecasts are telling us that now there is no problem, there is no peak oil because shale revolution is resolving everything. We don't know. And we don't know because A, the oil is underground, because the landscape is changing. You cannot predict what, if oil prices go to $150, the shale revolution will spread, but also other revolutions will happen because $150 will be a very strong incentive for entrepreneurs, for capitalists to put money and imagination to try to resolve the problem of oil. So in part, the shale revolution happened because we have $150 and we have still $100. So that's going to be a key factor. And the other question is that in the oil industry, we have very bad data about what's going on. You know how we know how much Saudi Arabia is producing? It's not because the Saudis well, the Saudis tell us a number, but we tend to not believe the number because it's not usually true. But let's not say Minister Naimi that, or he will make me do another round of jogging. We know how much Saudi Arabia is producing because in the 60s, the Americans, that they have the fleet in Bahrain, decided to put a lieutenant with binoculars in front of the Ras Tanura oil terminal and count the number of tankers that they were leaving and see how deep were on the water. So for the last 50 years, American lieutenants from the Navy and private companies have had people in Ras Tanura and other oil terminals in Saudi Arabia with their binoculars. Now they use also cameras and taking pictures of the tankers leaving the terminal, looking at how deep they are on the water and extrapolating how much oil is leaving. It's not particularly nice way to calculate the production of the largest oil producer of the most important commodity for the global economy. But that's the way we are doing it, and we have not invented anything different. So the data is sketchy, and the market is constantly changing because of prices are going up. And I am absolutely sure that some of what I told you today may have changed in the next 5 years. So you could invite me in 5 years, and I could tell you if I was wrong or not. But I strongly believe that an era of prices of $50 or below is completely over. And I strongly believe that to see oil prices on a consistent basis below $80 or $75, it will be very problematic. And probably if we were to have $75 oil, the last thing that you will care is about $75 oil, because it will be a sign that China has crashed and that the global economy is in recession, the equity market has completely collapsed, and there is a run on the dollar. So let's hope that that doesn't happen.
We will give you a chance to come back in 5 years' time, nonetheless. Javier Blas, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for speaking.
Thank you.
Godt, nu skal vi høre den sidste kaffepause. Det betyder, gå ud og tage en kop kaffe, tag den med ind igen. Og så starter vi om 10 minutter med den sidste taler, Jim Rogers.